Hello and welcome to Returning to Work After Concussion and Brain Injury. My name is Zoe Fallis, and I am an occupational therapist by background, registered in Ontario, Canada. I work with the Ontario Brain Injury Association, and today I'm going to speak to you about returning to work after a concussion and brain injury. Today I'm going to cover what the current research says about returning to work. How do you know someone is ready to return to work? Preparing yourself or preparing your client to return to work. The return to work process based on Ontario, Canada's legislation. And then I'll speak to you briefly about OBIA's new program regarding return to work, which is funded in part by the federal government. So what does the research say? We know right now that after a concussion and brain injury, individuals face many challenges and barriers returning to work. We know the inability to work and unemployment is linked to many mental health challenges, which includes depression, low self-esteem, and low life satisfaction. As well as we know that paid and gainful employment is one of the social determinants of health. There are several indicators that are correlated to an individual's successful return to work. So based on what the research says, some of the key indicators are a flexible work environment. Now, the research doesn't define what flexible means. However, when we look deeper into it, it incorporates things like being able to work from home or in a hybrid model, remote work. It looks at, can there be flexibility in their hours? Are they able to spread their hours over a 7-day period? Or can they work, instead of typically working 8 to 4, can they work 9 to 5, 10 to 6? Is there flexibility in the tasks that are assigned to them? And flexibility in their ability to modify their return to work plan as they gradually return, which I'll speak to later in this presentation. Another key indicator is that the employee feels supported and valued by the employer. And this is very important because not only do they have to feel supported by their employer, but often this relationship is established prior to their injury. So if they have a good relationship with their employer prior to injury, again, likely a successful return. And then finally, that the job is the right fit for the employee after they've sustained this type of injury. So by that, I mean they're still able to meet the key job demands, right? So for example, if someone has significant physical changes after a brain injury, they may not be able to be a paramedic or a firefighter, right? Physically demanding jobs. Whereas if they're able to return to their job with accommodation, then that is a success. That is a good fit. So return to work readiness is sort of, how do you know if a client is ready to go back? So the first thing I always ask is, have you been medically cleared? So that's a conversation with their primary healthcare provider or their medical team. And that's more from like a medical perspective. They often look at seizures and that sort of thing. And medically, are they stable and are they able to return to work, right? And if you want to dive in further from that, we want to look at their ability to manage their day-to-day tasks and symptoms. So often when we're having a conversation with someone who's thinking about going back to work, I want to know what their day-to-day looks like. Are they able to manage their self-care, right? Can they do their morning routine? Can they manage their medications? Can they go to the grocery store and meal plan and meal prepare? Can they manage their appointments, right? This is giving me a good sense is, can they manage their day-to-day prior to going back to work? Because if they're having trouble managing their basic needs, return to work is going to be a lot more challenging. And this goes to our next point, because they have to have the ability to prioritize work. Work does occupy a lot of our time, and so we need to make sure this individual is able to manage that on top of everything else that you have to continue to manage. You need to evaluate the risks associated with returning to work, right? So in the Canadian system, there are different streams that may impact someone's return to work. We do have motor vehicle claims, which sometimes can impact returning to work. We have something called LTD, which stands for long-term disability, and that's often something that's paid through insurance through the employer when somebody is off. And we also have something called ODSP, which is the Ontario Disability Support Program, which is if someone's off for an extended period of time due to a disability, they do get benefits and a small amount of money from the government. So going back to work may impact those types of financial situations. Does the person have insight and awareness of their abilities and possible accommodations? So by this, I mean, does the person understand how their symptoms is affecting their ability to function in their day-to-day life? And do they have enough awareness to start to implement strategies? Because that's going to be really important when someone goes back to work, that they know their limitations, so they know when they need to input a strategy, or when the employer asks them to do something that they're not sure they're able to complete, they're aware enough to say this may be a challenge, right? Flagging that as well. And they have supports in place. Symptoms will increase when somebody initially goes back to work, especially for those who've sustained a concussion. So going back to work will increase headaches, dizziness, light sensitivity. So it may be difficult to manage daily tasks, but what we want is, we're anticipating that, we just don't want it to become extreme and unmanageable. So preparing to return to work. So how do I help someone prepare to go back to work? One concept I use is called work hardening. Now, work hardening is definitely a specialized, individualized training that some rehab facilities use. So I'm just looking at some of the principles of work hardening and how an individual can start to incorporate that in their day-to-day. So one is, I want to encourage them to expose themselves to work-related tasks. So if there's somebody who spends time on the computer for work, I want them to start spending time on the computer. And I don't mean scrolling through social media or playing computer games. I want them to be doing some more focused work. So I might get them to organize a fake trip and pick dates, look at accommodation, read the reviews, pick restaurants that are near that location, to help them plan a budget, to help get them to understand those higher level planning, executive functioning skills while using an electronic device, which can sometimes increase our symptoms. I want them to practice reading and retaining information. So maybe that's reading a newspaper article on the computer or reading a book, and then presenting that information or talking to a friend, a loved one, about what they've read to ensure that they've retained what they've read. And then as well as follow verbal and written instructions, right? Now, these are examples of things of people who have maybe more of an office job. If they're a bit more of a physical job, I want them to increase their endurance by walking, doing exercises outside, cleaning their house, doing yard work, anything that's going to increase their physical endurance if they're in a more physical job. As well, I want to encourage them to slowly increase the amount of time they're able to complete tasks. So initially they can only do half an hour of work. We want to slowly start to build that to see if we can do an hour of work, right? And it's gradual. It won't happen overnight, but slowly start to increase that amount of time, and then increase the amount of tasks they can complete in a day. The other thing is practice the work routine. So that means complete your typical morning routine. So getting up, doing your whole morning routine, as well as practice your morning commute. So if And that means commuting at typical work hours. So if your client works at 8 a.m., that they need to practice getting to work at 8 a.m. on a Monday instead of practicing their commute on a Sunday. That's not representative of what they'll actually have to do. The other thing is we need to look at what strategies are they going to use to manage their symptoms. Now, we all know after a concussion and brain injury, there are so many different symptoms. I've just picked the most common ones to sort of talk about a little bit today. So we all know fatigue is the major symptom for most people who've had a concussion and brain injury. So we talk about reinforcing energy conservation strategies. So talk about planning, prioritizing, pacing, and positioning, right? So ways that they can start implementing these things prior to going back to work because they need to know how to manage their fatigue before they go back. Exercise. We know something simple as walking is a great way to improve our endurance, which will be and increase our energy. So making sure they're doing this prior to going back to work, again, to reduce fatigue. Memory loss and difficulty concentration, again, a very common symptoms. So they know their strategies that work best for them, right? Your client knows the strategies that work best for them. So you need to help them practice those strategies. So when they go back to work, they're sort of more habitual. They know how to use them. Pace yourself and take frequent breaks. So again, encouraging your client to figure out when they need to take their rest break. And then again, the use of assistive technology is fantastic. Other two very common symptoms are headaches and dizziness. So with headaches, again, we need to learn to tolerate activities with reduced symptoms. So we're anticipating when someone goes back to work, they will have headaches and dizziness. We just don't want them to be an 8, 9, or 10, right? We don't want them to be so extreme that they can't tolerate them, but can they tolerate a 4 or a 5, right? We may not eliminate the symptom completely, but can we reduce the frequency or the intensity of it? We know, again, emotional symptoms, so mental health, so feeling overwhelmed, anxiety, and depression are heavily linked with concussion and brain injury. So incorporating strategies that they can utilize when they're at work when it becomes stressful. We ran focus groups prior to developing our program, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And one of the key things employers said is that the inability to manage stress is one of the most difficult things to manage as an employer when they have someone coming back with a concussion and brain injury. So helping this individual learn how to manage that before they go back is so critical. So the return to work process. Now I'll be speaking again from the Ontario, Canada lens, because that is what I know. So I'm sure the Ukraine has similar policies, but I'll only be speaking to the Canadian policies. So again, similar to concussion and brain injuries, the return to work process is unique. There's no template that fits all. Each employer is structured, or workplace is structured differently, is a different environment, and each person with a concussion and brain injury has a unique set of symptoms and unique strategies that work well for them. So this is what makes it so challenging. There are different systems within Ontario, Canada that deal with return to work. So we have some private insurance that does, that individuals get through their workplace. We have WSIB, which is the system that supports someone if the injury happened at work. And then, like I said, we have ODSP, which is the Ontario Disability Support Program. We have EI, which is unemployment insurance. We have CPPD, which is sometimes people can go on our Canadian pension plan disability. So if they've had a disability, they can get access to the pension plan a little earlier. And then we have the organizations or the departments within work. So human resources, occupational health and safety. We have concussion clinics, outpatients, and if they've had motor vehicle accidents, there may be legal involved as well. So there's a bunch of different things influencing this return to work, which again can make it very complicated. And within Ontario, Canada, the employer does have a duty to accommodate until undue hardship. And part of that means so that, financially and the safety of all their clients and employees, are not impacted by the return of this individual. The individuals also have a responsibility to use their strategies effectively. And this is where, when we talk about some of those symptoms management, sometimes the employer can accommodate with things, but the individual themselves also has to know their strategies in order to go back to work, because the employer won't be able to accommodate everything. And return to work is a process, not an event. And that's, again, something that I really try to articulate to my clients, is even if returning to work specific to their previous job is not successful, hopefully it'll open doors to other things, or it'll expose them to something that they realize, this is not where I want to focus my time and energy. I want to change careers. Maybe I want to take early retirement. Maybe I want to spend time at home with my family, or maybe I need further recovery before I go back to work. So what are the components of a return to work plan? So it has to be individualized to the survivor or the employee's needs, right? So the person going back to work, it needs to be individualized for them. We know there's no template. However, there are 4 components that the plan should incorporate. Number 1, it needs to have a gradual return to work schedule. So again, in Ontario, some employers have a minimum amount of hours that they need to work before they can go back to work. So typically that starts at 4 hours a day. So typically what the start of the plan is 3 days a week at 4 hours, but it does depend on the employer and the job role. And the gradual return can be as short as 4 weeks or as long as 16 weeks. Now, we have no legislation on the time frame for a gradual return. I am trying to get more research and data on what is the success rate of a longer, slower, gradual return, right? I think often for some individuals who've had a concussion or brain injury, they need to start at fewer hours, right? They need to start at 2 hours twice a week or 2 hours 3 times a week, just to start exposing their brain to what's to come with the return to work. Then there's the second component, which is accommodations. And those are the things that are going to be in place, and they may be in place forever, right? So they may need to work from home, have flexible work hours, assistive technology. They may need to change the lighting in their environment, so none of those overhead fluorescent lights, the ability to wear a hat and sunglasses, have their own separate quiet office. So some of these accommodations may be permanent for the rest of their time at the organization they're with. There's also restrictions that can be put in place. Usually they're physical demands, so they can't lift something of a certain weight, or if there's a task that happens regularly, or that happens frequently and they do it a lot, and they can only do it occasionally or rarely. I often recommend restriction of meeting times initially. This is not necessarily an accommodation that can stay forever, but I do try and put it in at the start of their return to restrict their meeting times so their brain can get a break from the screen, especially for our concussion individuals who may be having challenges with the light and the glare from the screen. The 4th component is monitoring. And this I like to break it up into 2 parts. One is just sort of a weekly, more casual check-in from the employer with the employee to make sure things are going well and making sure the employee feels supported, right? Again, fostering that good employer-employee relationship. Then there also needs to be meetings, which is a more formal feedback, where you can actually discuss how, if changes need to be made to the return to work plan, or, if they can continue to progress with the return to work plan. And lastly, thinking about being flexible, going back to what the research says, we know flexibility increases the likelihood of a successful return. So being able to adapt the return to work plan or change it as the client progresses. So for example, if a client came to their employer and said, listen, I'm on my week 9 hours and duties, but I'm really struggling. And then the employer could say, well, why don't we go back to what you did during the week 8 of your gradual return to work plan, and then slowly work our way up again. So to give that flexibility with the return. So I'm going to take a few moments to discuss the return to work program that Hobaya has started. And it is funded in part by the Government of Canada. So the goal of our program is to improve the return to work process for concussion and brain injury survivors and increase the employer's capacity to support survivors. So we have 3 parts. We have the first part, which is in pink, which is the employer's support initiative. And that's an online training program for the employer. And they will also get access to a few consultation services through myself to help with understanding gradual return to work plans, specifically for individuals who've sustained a concussion and brain injury. The blue return to work program is an online training program for the employee, so for the individual who sustained the concussion or brain injury. And that's a way to help them understand their symptoms better, strategies, as well as, knowing a little bit about what to expect when returning to work, and similar things we spoke about today about how to better prepare themselves. And in the center, that purple section, are enhanced support services, is if both the employer and the employee take our training, they will then get access to occupational therapy. So myself and another member of our team who's a social worker, so the employee can get social work support to, again, help manage that ability to manage stress as they return to work. So this is just a quick breakdown about the employer support initiative and the topics that are covered in the online training, as well as the return to work program, which is for the employee, which breaks down their online training and what's incorporated in that. And then the enhanced support services, which is, again, a collaboration between the employer and the employee, sort of facilitated by myself. So I'll be able to provide some consultation with the employer and the employee surrounding accommodations and the guidance on the gradual return to work, as well as managing setbacks. And then the social worker can support the employee with either individual counseling, or they can participate in a facilitated return to work support group. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, you can email myself, Zoe Fallis, at zfallis@obaya.on.ca. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.